Hey guys, tonight we're setting sail somewhere far quieter. No swords, no kings, just the endless hum of waves and the memory of stars. We're heading into the heart of the Pacific, to a time when navigation wasn't written in books, but sung across the sea. Before compasses, before maps, there were the island libraries, living archives held in the minds of Polynesian navigators who could read the ocean like a story. So before we drift off together, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy falling asleep to history. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. I always love knowing where in the world you're tuning in. Now, get comfortable, let the sound of the waves take over, and let's begin tonight's calm voyage across the mysterious island libraries of Polynesian navigators. The ocean that remembered. Imagine standing on a small coral atoll at dusk, the horizon wide and shimmering in molten gold. The trade winds smell faintly of salt and breadfruit smoke. You can hear the steady rhythm of waves brushing against volcanic rock, a heartbeat older than any human song. This is where the story of Polynesian navigation begins, not in the libraries of marble and parchment that Europe adored, but in the rolling expanse of the Pacific, where the ocean itself was the book and memory was the ink. For centuries before the compass reached the Pacific, before even the idea of latitude and longitude became common knowledge, Polynesian navigators had mastered the art of reading the sea. They did not chart it in the way the Western world would later demand, with lines, grids, and mathematical precision, but rather through oral cartography. Their maps were stored not in ink, but in songs, chants, and the trained bodies of men who could feel the ocean's whispers through their bones. In the islands scattered across the triangle formed by Hawaii, New Zealand, and Easter Island, navigation was not merely a skill, it was a sacred discipline. The Polynesians, after all, had accomplished one of humanity's most astonishing feats of exploration. Without compasses, sextants, or written maps, they had found and settled over 1,000 islands across an ocean that covers 1/3 of the planet. And yet, their secret was never truly secret. It was simply misunderstood, dismissed by early Europeans, alayhi salam luck or myth, because they could not conceive of a people who carried their libraries inside their own minds. The libraries of these navigators were the islands themselves, each one a page in a vast and living book. Every coral reef, every current, every star that rose over a distant horizon was a word in their language of movement. The sea was the text, and the canoes were the pens. But to read it required a lifetime of quiet study, one that began in childhood and ended only with death. Children chosen to train alayhi salam navigators were often identified early, sometimes by signs or omens, sometimes simply because of lineage. A navigator's son might be taken from play to sit beside the elders, alayhi salam. They chanted the names of islands, Satawal, Picalat, Puluwat, and beyond. The chants were not songs of worship, though they sounded like hymns. Each line encoded the position of an island relative to others, the direction of prevailing winds, the paths of ocean swells, and even the habits of migratory birds. There were no books to read from, no diagrams to reference. The lessons were carved into memory through endless repetition, as the students listened to elders describe the world's geography through rhythm and rhyme. You could not graduate until the pattern of waves spoke to you alayhi salam fluently, like a mother tongue. To an outsider, it looked like a ritual. To the Polynesians, it was literacy, of the oldest and most practical kind. As night fell across the Pacific, the navigators' true classroom awakened. The sky became a canopy of stars, each one a fixed point in a grand, invisible compass. The most famous of these was the star compass, a mental framework dividing the horizon into rising and setting points of key stars. Unlike a physical tool, the star compass lived entirely within the mind. The navigator memorized where each star rose and set, how its position changed with the seasons, and which star replaced another as the night wore on. This knowledge was passed from generation to generation in chants known as Po, the night lessons. A navigator might recite hundreds of star paths, connecting each to the direction of swells, the colors of the sea, or the flight of birds. The process was both scientific and spiritual. A lapse of memory could mean death, but accuracy meant not just survival, but mastery. When European explorers like Captain Cook arrived in the Pacific, they were astonished by how these islanders found their way across distances that would have terrified seasoned sailors. Cook's navigator, Tupaya, was a priest and star reader from Raiatea who could draw entire maps from memory, showing islands hundreds of miles away, places he had never visited, yet could locate by their place in the songlines of the Pacific. When Cook's crew saw him describe islands far beyond the horizon, they recorded it with a mix of awe and skepticism. To them, maps had to be drawn on paper to be real. Tupaya's living atlas existed only in words, gestures, and the confident gaze of a man who trusted the ocean more than ink. These navigators did not think of themselves Alahaias explorers in the modern sense. They were caretakers of continuity. Each voyage was a conversation between generations, a reaffirmation that the world was still in order, that the stars had not betrayed them, that the sea's memory was still faithful. When a canoe left one island and disappeared beyond the horizon, it was not an act of bravery, but of trust. The navigator trusted the ocean to keep its promises, and the islanders trusted the navigator to remember the verses correctly. The materials of their craft were equally humble yet ingenious. Canoes were constructed from breadfruit or koa wood, lashed with coconut fiber rather than nails. The sails were woven from pandanus leaves. Every component of a canoe carried symbolic and practical meaning. The hull represented the body, the sail the spirit, and the lashings the bones that held it all together. When a navigator prepared for a journey, he would chant to the canoe Alahaias, though to awaken it, acknowledging it Alahaias, a living companion that shared the burden of memory. But the ocean was not always kind, nor was it always readable. Typhoons, rogue currents, and long stretches of gray horizon could erase even the most reliable cues. In such moments, navigators relied on a subtler skill, known Alahaias ATAC, a mental map of movement relative to imaginary islands. In Western navigation, the traveler marks their position on a fixed map. In ATAC, the opposite occurs. The navigator imagines themselves stationary while the islands move beneath them. It's a perspective shift, alayhi salam, profound alayhi salam. It is poetic, one that reflects a worldview in which human beings are not masters of the sea, but participants in its endless motion. When the waves grew wild or the stars vanished behind clouds, the navigator did not panic. He adjusted his ATOC, repositioning the islands in his mind's eye until the world made sense again. To lose one's ATOC was to be lost not just at sea, but in thought, a drifting of the soul alayhis salam, much alayhis salam of the body. The goal was not to dominate the ocean, but to remain in dialogue with it. You listened, you waited, you remembered. Over the centuries, these methods of navigation evolved into traditions so refined that entire islands were dedicated to teaching them. On Satawal, one of the Carolinian islands, navigation was taught in special stone enclosures that functioned alayhis salam open-air classrooms. The elders would draw lines in the sand to represent swells, currents, and star paths, erasing them by morning. The act of drawing was less about creating a record than reinforcing memory. The real map lived in the student's mind, invisible to anyone who did not know how to see. For Westerners accustomed to charts and compasses, the idea of invisible maps seemed impossibly mystical. Yet modern studies of oceanography and wave dynamics have confirmed the extraordinary accuracy of these traditional systems. Even without instruments, navigators could detect changes in ocean swells caused by distant islands, sometimes over 100 kilometers away. They read the subtle reflection of waves, the shadow of wind patterns, the behavior of seabirds, and even the smell of vegetation carried by trade winds. To them, the sea was a vast, textured field of information, a living page that only the trained could read. And so, the island libraries were not metaphorical at all. Each island stored a chapter of the Great Pacific text, and each navigator was a librarian, ensuring that none of it was lost. Knowledge was passed through ceremony, through apprenticeship, through the unbroken rhythm of chanting. But, like all libraries, it was vulnerable. When colonial rule and missionary influence spread across the Pacific, many of these oral archives began to fade. Writing replaced recitation. Western schooling replaced chanting. The libraries fell silent, not because they were burned, but because no one came to read them anymore. Yet, not all was lost. In the late 20th century, a quiet revival began. Elders from Satawal and the Caroline Islands, among them a master navigator named Maupiailug, began teaching a new generation. One of his students, Nainoa Thompson, became the first Hawaiian in centuries to sail the traditional canoe Hokulea across the Pacific without instruments, guided only by the stars and the lessons of oral tradition. The success of that voyage rekindled pride in Polynesian heritage and reminded the world that knowledge, even when unwritten, can endure across millennia. The waves continue to lap against coral shores, and constellations drift overhead. One wonders what it must feel like to carry the entire ocean in your mind. To know the position of stars, not by calculation, but by rhythm. To sense islands, not by sight, but by intuition. In that silence between wind and water, the Pacific becomes more than an ocean. It becomes a library, a place where memory is both map and mirror, where every ripple carries a word, and every voyage is a story waiting to be reread. And perhaps the most curious question remains. If the sea remembers everything, do the islands too remember the navigators who once read them? When you think of a library, perhaps you imagine quiet halls, the scent of parchment and dust, and the soft murmur of pages turning. But in the world of Polynesian navigation, a library did not smell of ink or leather. It smelled of salt and coconut oil, and it sang instead of whispered. The librarians were not scholars in robes, but seafarers with bare feet hardened by coral, and minds shaped by endless repetition. The archives were not shelves of books, but lines of melody carried by memory and wind. To learn the songs that charted the sea was to inherit the history of your people. The Polynesian Navigators of Micronesia called these songs rupun, the bones of the path. Each verse encoded a part of the voyage, a set of directions, landmarks, and cues for interpreting waves, stars, and birds. Every chant was a chain of islands, each island a verse, and each verse a survival manual. But unlike the songs we hum to pass time, these chants were meant to preserve time, to store knowledge in rhythm, to ensure that the sea's story was never forgotten. You might imagine a small hut near the shore, its roof woven from pandanus leaves, the air thick with the scent of roasted taro and ocean spray. Inside, an elder sits cross-legged beside a boy of 12, his expression caught between awe and confusion. The elder begins to hum, a low, rhythmic pulse that imitates the waves. The boy listens. The elder continues, weaving words that seem almost meaningless to the untrained ear. When the bird with red wings rises from the left of the sun, steer to the dark wave that hums. It sounds poetic, perhaps even cryptic, but to those who understand, it is a precise navigational code. In Polynesian tradition, the language of direction was metaphorical because the sea itself was alive. Waves were described alaihi salam breathing, stars alaihi salam walking, winds alaihi salam whispering. The elder's chant was a living document, guiding the canoe through metaphors that doubled alaihi salam coordinates. For example, the bird with red wings might refer to a particular constellation, perhaps Aldebaran, whose reddish hue signaled a westward bearing. The dark wave that hums could indicate a current caused by an underwater ridge. Each metaphor was a mnemonic, a tool to remember not just the destination, but the feeling of traveling toward it. Western historians sometimes struggled to believe these chants were scientific. For generations, colonial ethnographers recorded them as curiosities. Native poems, they called them, without realizing they were navigational equations. It would take oceanographers in the 20th century to prove that many of these metaphors described real, measurable phenomena. A pattern of swells described in one chant, dismissed for years as poetic exaggeration, was later confirmed by wave radar imaging. The ancestors had measured the sea with their senses alone, and their metaphors were not metaphors at all. The songs also carried warnings about reefs, storms, and the limits of courage. One common refrain among the Marshall Islanders went, "If the sea grows teeth, turn the sail and wait." The teeth meant whitecaps, the first sign that the wind was shifting too quickly. Another chant instructed navigators to listen for the voice of the island before you see its face. This referred to the way waves refract off an island's shores, creating a faint, echo-like pulse that experienced navigators could feel through the hull long before land appeared. These chants formed the backbone of what anthropologists now call ethnocartography, the mapping of the world through cultural knowledge rather than instruments. The navigator's brain functioned like a living GPS, storing hundreds of variables that changed hourly. The angle of starlight, the sound of waves against the canoe, the color of the horizon at dawn, the scent of vegetation on the wind. Each piece of sensory input was cross-referenced against the remembered songs, confirming or correcting the imagined map in the mind. But this memory system had one unusual quality. It required the body.
The navigators' minds and muscles worked together, forming what modern scientists call embodied cognition. The navigator would lie prone at the base of the canoe, feeling for the rhythm of swells. His fingertips and back acted alayhi salam sensors, interpreting the subtle differences between the main wave and reflected waves. The chant guided his awareness. Each verse corresponded to a physical sensation. Over time, the song became not something recited, but something felt. To train this sensitivity, apprentices would spend years accompanying elders on voyages without steering. They were not allowed to touch the sail or the rudder. Their only task was to feel, to memorize the cadence of the ocean, the sequence of waves, and the way the canoe responded. Some navigators described feeling a map inside the chest, a bodily awareness of direction even when all visible markers were gone. When questioned by Western scientists, they could not explain how they knew where they were. They simply said, "The sea tells us." This kind of memory demanded stillness and humility. Navigators were not conquerors of the ocean. They were its students. They did not impose order upon it. They listened until order revealed itself. The chants were prayers, alayhi salam, much alayhi salam instructions, filled with respect for the living forces that made travel possible. Before each voyage, a navigator would offer coconut water to the sea, whispering thanks for its patience. The ritual was simple, but profound. Gratitude was part of navigation, alayhi salam necessary as knowing the stars. The island libraries extended beyond memory into architecture as well. In certain islands, particularly in the Carolines and Marshalls, men constructed small stone models of the ocean, miniature maps known as rebelib and matang. These stick charts, made of palm ribs and shells, represented the directions of prevailing swells and the locations of islands. But these charts were never brought on voyages.
They were teaching tools, reminders of patterns that must eventually be memorized and internalized. The chart was like a teacher's pointer. It guided thought, but could not replace experience. Each rebelib was unique, handcrafted for specific routes and purposes. The curved sticks represented the motion of waves. Straight lines showed main currents. Shells indicated islands. When the student studied the chart, he would trace each curve with his fingers, memorizing not just the shapes, but the rhythm implied within them. Once the pattern was internalized, the chart was set aside, its purpose fulfilled. This process blurred the boundary between map and ritual. The rebelib was not a static object, but an invitation to remember, a mnemonic scaffold to rebuild the sea within the mind. Across the Pacific, these practices wove together into an intricate network of shared knowledge. Polynesian, Micronesian, and Melanesian navigators often met through trade or intermarriage, exchanging songs and techniques. A chant from Samoa might reference a star known by another name in Tahiti, yet the melody would still make sense. The ocean connected them, like ink connects letters on a page. Some historians have even proposed that the Pacific should be viewed not alayhi salam, a collection of isolated islands, but alayhi salam, a single immense continent of water, its villages linked by canoes rather than roads. The sociologist Epeli Haofa called this concept the Sea of Islands, a rejection of the colonial idea that ocean equals isolation. For Polynesians, the ocean was never a barrier but a bridge.
Their navigation system embodied this worldview. To travel was not to escape home, but to extend it. When a canoe left an island, it carried that island's memory with it. When it arrived somewhere new, it left behind a fragment of its own story. The sea, therefore, became a vast conversation, one that continues even now in the rhythms of language and wind. But by the mid-19th century, those rhythms began to fade. Western colonial powers, armed with compasses and cannons, brought with them a new kind of navigation, one that relied on instruments instead of memory. Missionaries discouraged traditional chants, labeling them pagan incantations. Schools taught reading and writing, but not the songs of the sea. In a single generation, centuries of oral knowledge risked vanishing. Some navigators refused to teach their children, fearing punishment or ridicule.
Others continued in secret, chanting at night when the waves drowned their voices. The silence grew. Islands that had once been connected by shared stories became isolated by modern borders. The libraries of memory fell into disuse. And yet, scattered across the Pacific, a few keepers remained, men who still knew the old songs and the meaning of stars. In the tiny atoll of Satawal, one such man, Mau Piailug, held on to what his ancestors had taught him. Mau's story would one day rekindle the dying art of celestial navigation, but at that time he was simply one of the last librarians of the ocean. He had learned to navigate at the age of 5, memorizing the names of more than 200 stars and the shape of dozens of ocean swells. He could feel land hundreds of miles away, sense a storm's direction by taste, and recall ancient chants so old that even their words had shifted. To Westerners, he seemed otherworldly. To his people, he was simply one who remembered. It was Mau who would later teach the Hawaiians how to sail once more, by star and swell, reviving a heritage nearly extinguished. But at this moment in our story, he was still a solitary figure, an island of knowledge adrift in the modern tide. His memory contained the invisible geography of an entire civilization, and though he did not know it yet, his chants would one day awaken the hokulea, a canoe that would restore pride to a culture long silenced. Yet one cannot help but wonder, when knowledge depends entirely on memory, on the fragile network of human voices and living minds, what happens when silence falls? Can an ocean forget its own songs, or do they linger, waiting for someone patient enough to listen once more? The modern world, for all its speed and noise, has always looked curiously upon silence. When satellite maps, radar, and electronic charts replaced memory and intuition, it seemed that the ocean had finally been conquered. Yet somewhere across the Pacific, between the blue stillness of Micronesia and the restless horizon of Hawaii, a few quiet men still read the sea the old way. They were the last living keepers of the island libraries. By the mid-20th century, traditional navigation had almost vanished from the Pacific. Air travel and motorboats had shortened distances, but also dulled the ancient awareness of space. Few young people saw the value in memorizing the stars when they could follow a compass or radio beacon. The chants fell silent, and in that silence, the ocean seemed to lose part of its voice. But memory has a strange persistence. Even when forgotten, it lingers beneath the surface, like a reef hidden by the tide, waiting for the water to fall again. In 1973, a group of Hawaiian scholars, artists, and activists gathered with one shared dream: to prove that their ancestors had not been aimless wanderers, but deliberate explorers who navigated by skill and science.
They formed the Polynesian Voyaging Society, a modest organization with an ambitious goal: to build a double-hulled canoe like those of ancient times and sail it across the Pacific using only traditional methods. The canoe would be named Hokulea, meaning Star of Gladness, after a guiding star known to appear when travelers reached home. But there was a problem. No one in Hawaii remembered how to sail by the old ways. The island libraries had closed long ago. The elders who once carried that knowledge had passed on, their songs buried with them. So the society began to search beyond their own shores. They heard rumors of a man from a tiny island called Satawal, a man who could still read the sea by its rhythm, who could name the stars without a telescope, who could find his way across thousands of miles of open ocean without ever glancing at a compass. His name was Mau Piailug. When the Hawaiians found him, Mau was reluctant. He spoke little English, and his world was far from the modern bustle of Honolulu. Satawal had no cars, no electricity, and no written records. Only stories, waves, and stars. Mau feared that if he shared his knowledge with outsiders, they might misuse or misunderstand it. But when he saw how deeply the Hawaiians wished to remember, he agreed. "I will teach you," he said softly, "because if I do not, all of this will die." And so, under the shadow of palm trees and the rising constellations, the lessons began. Mau taught not from books, but from experience. His classroom was the open deck of Hokulea, and his chalkboard was the ocean. He began by showing his students how to read the star compass, the invisible circle of directions defined by the rising and setting points of stars along the horizon. He divided the sky into 32 houses, each anchored by a specific star or constellation. As the Earth rotated, these celestial markers appeared to move, providing an ever-changing but predictable system of bearings. "You do not move," Mau told them. "The stars move. When you keep the stars in your head, you are never lost." His students, led by the young navigator Naiona Thompson, struggled at first. They were children of the modern age, more comfortable with books than with silence. To Mau, navigation was a form of listening, not just to stars, but to swells, wind, and instinct. "The sea speaks," he said, "but she only whispers." To train their senses, he made them lie flat on the canoe's deck at night, eyes closed, feeling the movement beneath them. The subtle shift of a wave, the faint echo of a reflected swell, these were sentences in the ocean's language. "When the wind changes, she tells you," Mau explained. "When a bird flies far, it tells you. Everything tells you. You must listen to all of it." He taught them to identify stars by brightness and color, to sense the direction of a swell even when blindfolded, and to detect an island by the way clouds gathered over it at dawn. Each lesson was a return to an older rhythm, a quieter heartbeat beneath the modern hum of engines. Elias the crew learned, so too did they remember who they were. Navigation was not only a means of travel, it was identity, language, and belonging. To sail traditionally was to reconnect with ancestors who had once crossed the same ocean in search of new homes. By 1976, the Hokulea was ready. Her twin hulls gleamed under the tropical sun, her sails woven in the old way. Thousands gathered to watch her departure from Hawaii to Tahiti, a journey of more than 2,500 miles across open ocean. No compass, no GPS, no instruments,
only Mau's memory and the stars. Elias Hokulea slipped beyond the horizon. Silence settled over the crowd. It was the silence of faith, the same kind of trust that ancient islanders must have felt when a canoe vanished into the endless blue. For weeks, the crew followed Mau's guidance. The stars rose and fell, Elias expected. The swells sang their low, rhythmic song. The winds shifted, and Mau adjusted their course by a hair's breadth. He rarely slept. He often sat in silence, gazing at the horizon, his hand resting lightly on the canoe's edge, Elias if feeling the pulse of the world. When at last Tahiti appeared on the horizon, the crew wept. They had done it, sailed across the Pacific Elias their ancestors had, guided by nothing but the memory of stars. When Hokulea entered the harbor, thousands of Tahitians greeted her, chanting in welcome.
To them, the arrival was not just a visit, it was a homecoming. News of the voyage spread across the Pacific and beyond. Scholars called it one of the greatest acts of cultural revival in modern history. For Mau, it was something simpler, proof that the ocean's memory still lived. Now, he said, my knowledge will not die. After the voyage, Mau returned to Satawal, but his teachings continued through his Hawaiian students, especially Nainoa Thompson, who became the first Polynesian in centuries to master celestial navigation through both traditional and scientific understanding. He refined Mau's teachings into a modern educational framework, ensuring that future generations could learn the way of the stars. In time, Hokulea would embark on more voyages, to Aotearoa, to Rapa Nui, to Alaska, to Japan, even around the world. At every port, she carried not cargo, but memory. The idea that navigation is not merely a technology, but a way of knowing one's place in the universe. And with each voyage, the island libraries reopened. The songs of the sea were sung again. Children began learning the names of stars their grandparents had forgotten. The chants returned to ceremonies, and elders wept quietly, knowing that the old ways were breathing once more. Yet Mau's teachings carried something deeper than technique. They carried a philosophy that knowledge is not ownership, but relationship. To know the sea, you must care for it. To read the stars, you must live in rhythm with them. Navigation, in Mau's words, was not about control. It was about harmony. You are not greater than the sea, he said. You are part of it. Even now, the Pacific remembers. The ocean currents that once guided canoes still flow in their ancient paths. The constellations still rise and fall in their eternal cycles. The difference is that, once again, there are eyes watching them, not through instruments, but through reverence. When Hokulea completed her worldwide voyage in 2017, the crew carried stones from each island visited and returned them to Hawaii, symbolizing the reconnection of the world's shores. The stones were placed together in a circle, small islands in miniature, reminding all who saw them that the sea is not empty space, but a bridge that binds us. And so the libraries live on, not in marble halls or digital archives, but in minds that remember and waves that whisper. They live in the chant of an elder, in the careful fingers of a canoe builder, in the eyes of a child tracing constellations across the night sky. Perhaps, in that sense, the Pacific Ocean is still the largest library in the world, one written not in ink, but in motion. And if you listen closely, on a calm night far from land, you might still hear the faint rhythm of those ancient songs. They are not gone, merely quiet, waiting for someone, somewhere, to begin reading again. But there remains one question, drifting like a forgotten star across the horizon. When the last navigator has sailed and the songs fall silent once more, who will remember to keep the sea alive? The ocean has always been patient. It remembers everything, yet speaks so softly that only a few ever learn to listen. For the Polynesian navigators, listening was survival, art, and faith all at once. But what happens when the world grows louder, when the hum of engines and the static of radios drown out the whisper of waves? That is where the last part of our story begins, not in the age of exploration, but in the quiet age of rediscovery. In the decades after Hokulea's first triumphant voyage to Tahiti, the Pacific entered a new kind of renaissance. Islands that had long been separated by colonial borders began to find each other again, not through politics, but through shared memory. The idea that we were all navigators once became a rallying cry for cultural revival. Schools in Hawaii, Micronesia, and New Zealand began offering courses on celestial navigation, often taught outdoors under the night sky. Elders, once dismissed Alaihi Salam's relics of the past, became revered professors. Where textbooks once began with the arrival of Europeans, they now began with the rise of the stars. In one of these classrooms, a simple clearing near the beach on Satawal, Mau Piailug continued to teach until his final years. He was never a man of speeches or ceremony. He preferred to teach by example. He would arrive barefoot, carrying a piece of driftwood to draw diagrams in the sand. Around him, children gathered, their notebooks forgotten, as they listened to the rhythm of his voice. He would point to the horizon and name the stars: Altair, Antares, Sirius, Hokulea. His hand would move with the fluid precision of someone who had drawn these constellations 1,000 times in his mind. Then he would erase his drawings with one sweep of his palm. "Never trust the sand," he would say, smiling.
It forgets with the tide. Trust your head, trust your heart. They travel with you. Mao's philosophy was simple but profound. Knowledge must live, not rest. A map on paper is dead the moment it is drawn. A map in the mind is alive along it is remembered. His students learned this by practice, not theory. He would blindfold them on calm nights and have them sit quietly on the canoe, feeling the water move beneath them. Then, without warning, he would ask, "Which way is home?" Most guessed wrong at first. The ocean, after all, has no walls or signposts. But over time, they began to notice the faintest cues, the difference between one swell and another, the angle of a breeze, the sound of water against the hull. Eventually, the answers became second nature. They were not remembering facts, they were remembering relationships. This, perhaps, is the greatest secret of the island libraries. Their true subject was not geography, but relationship. The navigators did not merely memorize positions of stars and islands, they memorized how everything was connected. The sea was not a space between points, but a living network where every movement influenced another.
Modern oceanographers, using satellite imaging and computational modeling, have since confirmed that the Pacific currents form intricate, predictable loops. But long before computers, the navigators already knew this through observation and intuition. Theirs was an intelligence born not of abstraction, but of attention. To them, memory was not storage, it was participation. You remembered the sea by being part of it. You remembered the stars by watching them move across the same sky your ancestors once studied. You remembered the islands not along coordinates, but along living beings with moods, voices, and histories. In the early 21st century, Hokulea and her sister canoes began a new series of voyages, not just across the Pacific, but around the entire world. Their mission was called Malamahonua, to care for the earth. The message was clear. The lessons of navigation were not just about travel, but about balance. If humanity could remember how to live in harmony with the sea, perhaps it could also remember how to live in harmony with the planet. When Hokulea reached Africa, elders of desert tribes came to greet her. They spoke of their own navigation traditions, how they read sand dunes the way Polynesians read waves.
In the Arctic, Inuit navigators shared stories of ice trails that changed like living rivers. Everywhere the canoe went, people recognized something familiar: the ancient human art of finding one's way without machines. It was alayhi salam if Hokulea had awakened not only Pacific memory, but a global one. The shared truth that navigation, at its heart, is about understanding where you are, where you come from, and where you belong. When Mau Piailug passed away in 2010, his funeral was held by the sea. Hundreds came: Hawaiians, Micronesians, Tahitians, and more. They carried leis and star maps, and they sang the chants he had once taught. In his final years, Mau had expressed only one wish: that his people would keep sailing. The sea never dies, he had said. Only the people forget. That night, after the funeral, the sky cleared. The stars rose in their familiar sequence, just alayhi salam had described. His students looked up and smiled. "He's still sailing," one whispered. They knew what he meant. The memory of Mau, like the memory of the ocean, had no end. It continued in every canoe that left the shore, in every apprentice who learned to read the swells, in every voice that sang the old chants once thought lost. Today, across the Pacific, dozens of voyaging societies continue this legacy. Children in classrooms from Samoa to Rapa Nui learn the star compass alongside mathematics. Modern canoes, built in both wood and fiberglass, travel thousands of miles without instruments. And each time they do, they reopen another page of the island libraries. One of these canoes, Hikianalia, sails alongside Hokulea, equipped with solar panels but guided by stars. Its crew speaks often about balance, the harmony between ancient wisdom and modern sustainability. They say that Mau's greatest gift was not simply teaching people how to find islands, but how to find meaning. Because navigation, in the end, is about more than arrival. It is about attention, about noticing the small signs that guide you, the slow patterns that shape the world. The navigator's art reminds us that knowledge need not be loud to be powerful. It can be quiet, rhythmic, even boring, and yet hold within it the entire architecture of survival. Alayhi salam, we drift toward the end of this story. Picture once more the vast Pacific night. The sea is calm, the stars burn faintly gold, and a canoe cuts through the dark like a line of ink across parchment.
The navigator sits at the stern, his eyes half closed, murmuring the old verses. He is both reader and writer of this great watery book. He feels the swell, tastes the wind, and knows exactly where he is. Not because he sees the island, but because he remembers it. It is there, just beyond the horizon, its presence confirmed by the rhythm of the waves, the tilt of the stars, the echo in his chest. He smiles, knowing the truth his ancestors always knew, that the sea, like memory, is never empty. It is full of everything that has ever been. Every ripple, every song, every voyage still lives somewhere within it. The ocean does not forget. It only waits for someone to listen again. And so, the mysterious island libraries of the Polynesian Navigators remain open, not bound by walls or paper, but by trust, rhythm, and the gentle patience of the tide. Their knowledge endures not in monuments or museums, but in the simplest of acts. A canoe leaving shore, a hand feeling the wind, a voice whispering the names of stars. Because to remember the ocean is, in a way, to remember ourselves. For we too are travelers, small vessels afloat upon time, guided by the faint but steady light of memory.